Hello, my name is Marco Palma. I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and also director of our Human Behavior Lab here at Texas A&M. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about myself and the lab. My background is in behavioral economics. So what that means is that I try to understand human behavior through experiments. And there are a couple of requirements for the experiments that we do here at the Human Behavior Lab. The first one is that we try to implement experiments with incentives. What people say they're going to do and what they actually do when there is money or real actions, real consequences to what they do is not necessarily the same thing. And so we're trying to bridge that gap by implementing economic experiments with real money in real markets with real food products. That way we know that we're looking at real behavior that is really representative of behavior of what people will do in the real world. The second thing is that we always are truthful in what we tell our subjects. There is no deception in any of our experiments because that ensures that people come here in good faith and they try really hard and they really provide answers to what they really prefer to do in the settings that we are trying to study and understand behavior. So those are the big picture things that we try to implement in our experiments. As a behavioral experimental economist, I see the world through experiments. And what I'm going to try to do today during this lecture is to convey a few key messages about what triggers our decisions and to try to understand the very complex workings in our brains as we make decisions and provide different sort of options and how do we optimize those decision making in some context, or sometimes how difficult it is for us human beings to make those decisions. So in this lecture, we're going to really concentrate on food and food choices and their link to nutrition. But whenever possible, I also want to draw into some general human behavior that would be relevant to this course. And so without further ado, let me try to start by telling you about neuroeconomics. This is sort of the type of work that we try to do at the Human Behavior Lab. We are one of the largest academic labs in the world to study human behavior and to specifically target food choices and agricultural production. So neuroeconomics is this very relatively new discipline that combines concepts from mainly three disciplines. The first one is economics. And so from economics, we really draw on trying to understand the behavior from the outcome perspective. So we live in a world where human beings, we all face trade-offs. We all face situations in which we have to make decisions with unlimited wants. We always want more of something positive, but we have limited resources in terms of money and time and other constraints. And so it's important for us to try to predict what people are going to do and to see how their behavior might change if we change that setting. From the second perspective, discipline of psychology, it's important that we understand not only the outcomes or predict those outcomes, but what drives those decisions. What are the processes that drove us to make those decisions? And then from the neuroscience, it's important for us to understand how our brain and our body reacts to different stimuli to try to see if we have some principles and some function in our brains that is predetermined or explaining certain type of behavior that might not necessarily map with some intended actions. Now, there might be other disciplines that we are trying to incorporate within the neuroeconomics paradigm, but in general, I think that this relationship among all of these disciplines might be better suited and better explained through an example. So let me go through an example. One of the things that we observe today is this overconsumption of sugar. It's something that is prevalent, whether it's children, adolescents, adult populations. We all tend to consume more sugar than we should. And this probably goes along for other nutrients as well that are not necessarily as beneficial. In general, when we look at dietary habits, we see that we consume too much of the things we're not supposed to and too little of the beneficial things that we're supposed to consume. So let me take you back into a journey, back to the time where human beings were hunters and gatherers. Back at that time, we humans used to spend a lot of our energy devoted to trying to find food, largely by gathering food that was available. Up to 90% of our energy at that time was spent trying to find food. So if you think about income, it would be like almost as if we spend 90% of our money or our effort. That's how we get now money. And obviously at that time we didn't have any monetary exchange systems. And so 90% of the energy was spent trying to find food. Now, sugars in general and starches were very important because you humans are able to store calories when we consume starches. So sugar could have been the difference between living and dying because we were able to store those calories for periods of food scarcity. Now, how important was that for early humans that we could survive or die based on finding those foods? If you look at the activity in the brain when we consume sugar, it's very similar to consuming highly addictive substances such as cocaine and other drugs. Imagine that, how powerful that is. So consuming sugar gives you about the same reward system in the brain as consuming drugs. Now this is something that we can explain back at that time because there was a need for human beings to survive and the preservation of the species depended on that. So finding those starchy foods could have made the difference. And so the brains reward those early individuals with that high amount of reward to ensure that we had incentives to try to find those foods. Now the problem is that as much as it was useful back in that time, we now live in a world where the technological advances and the progress that we have made in agriculture have made it such that we cannot procure sugar and other starches at substantially less expensive. Now sugar is very cheap to get, but yet we're still in a situation where our brains are still rewarding us in the same way that it used to be. So this graph showcases that the technological progress has advanced quite a substantial amount, where the evolution of the brain has not necessarily catch up or kept at the same pace. So the result is that we have our brains, that are still rewarding us in similar ways as they used to back at the time when we were hunters and gatherers, but now we can procure that food much cheaper. And so these two things seem to be working against the outcomes that we want in terms of reducing sugar consumption. Now, one of the things that we have seen in some of the latest research is that not everybody faces the same urges. In fact, there are some literature that showcase that there's certain individuals that have a predisposition to have certain urges towards certain kinds of foods. In fact, there is this idea that people experience an anticipatory effect in consuming the food. What that means is that they get a rush or a reward from the anticipation of an action rather than the action itself. And when we conducted some experiments to look into this, we were able to show that obese individuals experience this anticipation effect when they're about to get some food. So this is equivalent for you thinking about you go to the restaurant, you're not necessarily eating the food yet, but you have placed your order and you know the food is coming. And that anticipation of knowing that the food is coming is enough to showcase that the brain activity of these individuals experienced a substantial boost by knowing that the food was coming. Now, this behavior was not present in healthy weight individuals. And so this showcases that there are some very remarkable differences in that not everybody experiences the same type of urges and the same type of self-control issues. We will get back to these in the presentation when we talk about self-control, but I wanted to make sure that we understand here that our brains are really telling us that there is a differential activation potentially in some individuals that have a predisposition for some actions, while others might not necessarily have the same situation. It's almost as if we think about a market good and think about trying to select the perfect hot sauce. When we're trying to select the perfect hot sauce, I really like it very, very spicy. So I can really enjoy something that has a very, very high level of heat. Now, there might be some other individuals that do not like heat at all. Now imagine that we live in a world where you only have these two types of consumers, and if you went by the law of averages, then you will probably get somewhere in the middle and you will get a lot of unhappy people. Now, even if you had a segment of consumers who were similar in terms of the taste for that average level of heat, you might still be missing certain segment of consumers. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there's not one unique customer. There's not one unique reaction from the consumer, but rather we have different kinds or classes of consumers. So the first task that we need to understand, whether we think about trying to promote, market, or sell a product, or trying to look at the potential effects of an intervention, is that we need to try to identify the classes of individuals in terms of how they behave towards something. Once we identify the classes, it might be easier for us to deliver interventions, to deliver something, including products, services that will satisfy the needs of those particular individuals. So when we think about these, we should be thinking about precision action, adaptive interventions, and customization of some of those products. We see the markets are actually banking on these, from shoes to services where people are able to customize what they need from some basic level of provision for those products. And so it's important that as we move forward, we try to consider how this customization might increase the customer satisfaction. It might increase the likelihood that the products will be successful in markets. It might improve the potential outcomes of interventions and so on. Now, in looking at this evolutionary biology, it's important to see how we have certain features in our brains that are still active today from an evolutionary perspective that might drive us to really make some decisions and take some actions that are not necessarily optimal in today's environment. It might have been optimal hundreds of years ago, but now we live in a different environment, such as the example that we just went through with sugar. Now, this is one of my favorite papers, and this is by my colleague here, Jessica Jurczynski at Texas A&M. And what she did is she brought students into the lab and she asked them to find the animal that was different. And you can see some of the pictures here that included some predators like lions and some other animals that were not necessarily threatening to the individuals. Now, what she found is when there was a predator present, students were able to find that predator and they went to that predator much faster than they did compared to the other animals. Now, I don't know about you, but how many of you had to run away from a lion to get to class or to get to campus today? So that's certainly not an ability that is useful today, but yet it's something that has been ingrained in our brains. And so it's important for us to understand that we have some of those features in our brains that from a preservation of the species standpoint that are still present, that might be affecting the way we make decisions today. When it comes to the brain, there are three areas that I really want to highlight. And I want to keep this fairly simple, but I think it is important that you understand the relationship among these areas and how do they relate to the neuroeconomics study of human behavior. The first area is the brainstem. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that sometimes people refer to these in terms of evolution, as if different areas of the brains evolve at different times. But today we know that this is not necessarily the case. It has nothing to do with evolution, but it actually has to do a lot more with the function of these areas of the brain. And so the brainstem regulates automatic processes. This is very good for us human beings because we do not want to have to control those things. Things like heart rate, respiration rate, how much sweat does the body produce to try to regulate temperature, the size of the pupil to regulate so we're able to see and adapt to changes in the light conditions, although the pupil also dilates in reaction to emotional reactions. And so blood pressure, many of these features that are pretty much automatic are regulated in the brainstem. And they're very important. You're going to see why here in a minute. Now, the second part I want to talk about is the limbic system, which is in large the emotional side of the brain. This is where we see a lot of activity related to processing something that we truly enjoy, pleasure, and so on and so forth. And so this is largely the center of emotions. And so when you think about feeling affection or having those bursts of affective reactions, that's the region of the brain responsible for processing those actions. And so the next part is the prefrontal cortex. Here is the executive function of the brain. So a lot of the very complex decision-making, self-control activities happen in the region of the brain. So what is the interrelationship between them is that where there might be some trade-offs and some activity in the brain for looking at something that we truly enjoy, like in the limbic system, and then the prefrontal cortex is also at constant activation to try to exercise that self-control. Now there's a very particular region in the prefrontal cortex called the nucleus accumbens in some areas, like the ventral striata, that process pleasure, that process something that we experience some positive dimensions, and they have earned this honorary place in the limbic system because it's kind of like a highly emotional area of that particular system. But the point here is that these areas are interacting as we make those decisions, almost as if the representation that economists have brought to light about us having these two different selves inside of us that are in constant fight. It's some biological evidence here that there are some processes in the brain that might be competing as we make those decisions. Importantly, some decisions that might have originated in the prefrontal cortex or perhaps in the limbic system can also be manifested in the body as physiological reactions. And so, for example, if we are engaging in an action that requires us to make a decision as to whether we flight or fight, suppose that we're supposed to engage in a public speaking situation, and there's a little bit of alertness in our body, that activity that started in the amygdala, probably in the brain, that gives us a little bit of fear and a little bit of pressure, it started in that particular area of the brain. But then there are also some physiological responses. So our bodies, the muscles will tense, our pupils will dilate, we will start sweating a little bit, our blood pressure increases, and all of these things are getting the body ready to react to that stimuli. So importantly, we can read the activity in the brain directly, but we're also able to look at the bodies. And our bodies are telling the story, not necessarily just about what we do, but how we feel when we're taking that action. And so we can look at things like, hey, we can look directly at the brain using EEG, or we can also use other devices to look at these physiological responses. And so here at the lab, we have, for example, eye tracking devices in which we can look at what attracts the visual attention of participants. We can also measure the pupil size, and we can use that as controlling for light conditions. We can use this as a measure of arousal and emotional engagement to those stimuli. We can look at respiration rates and galvanic skin response, or the amount of sweat in our hands, as a way to look at stress and how we're reacting under stressful conditions. We can look at response time as a way for preference. If we decide onto something, do you want the apple right now? Yes. If you respond immediately, it shows us that you're really, really sure about the decision. So you have strong preferences for that. But if you're deciding between eating it or not, or you're deciding between two products and you're taking a long time, that's a signal that perhaps that's a more difficult decision, because those products are more difficult to choose from. It means that it might be closer in preference. So that's why it becomes a difficult decision. So response time can also be a way in which we can assess the strength of preferences for certain products. Now, one of the things I want to start to talk about is this very delicate line between the context and perception. When does perception becomes a reality? Let me start by a very interesting example about the time when McDonald's decided to ban trans fats from their French fries. They did this to try to provide customers with healthier products. Now, McDonald's had been around for a long time, so they didn't just shut down and immediately ban trans fat everywhere. They actually did it in some restaurants while keeping the trans fat in other restaurants, because they wanted to see what was the potential economic effect or any customer service complaints by banning the trans fats. What happened was interesting, because everybody started complaining that the fries did not taste good anymore, even in the restaurants that had not made the switch. So the fact that people had the perception that something changed that could have affected the taste was enough for people to actually experience a loss. Now, is that a fault in the way we reason? Is that some weakness in our decision? Well, we're going to look at what is the physiological process that happens in the next couple of slides. So one of the things that I like to talk about when we look at this is the role of the environment in shaping up how we perceive something. And so this was a social experiment, so it was not a scientific control experiment. But what happened was that people brought, in the social experiment, participants were brought into a restaurant that had top of the line everything. It was a luxury everywhere. The plates were really nice. It was actual silverware. There were sculptures in the restaurant. Everything was top of the line luxury. And it was an Italian restaurant. And when people tasted the food, they said, this is really some of the best Italian food I've ever had in my life. Now, it turns out in this social experiment that food was delivered from Pizza Hut. And so it was not the food itself, but it was the surrounding environment that made people have this perception that the food was such luxurious, high quality, that it made them enjoy that food a little bit more. Now, again, I ask the question, is this a faulty way we're perceiving something? What is the nature behind this? Let me show you another example outside of food to see how we might use the context and the situation to showcase and form ideas about the quality of certain products. So perhaps this video would be very useful for us to get into that.
Watch these fashion lovers in a mad dash to go after these sleek-looking shoes.
Very, European, very, upscale.
For me to experience this as an Italian designer is amazing.
I could definitely wear this to like a Met Gala dinner.
They're willing to pay top dollar.
I would pay $400, $500. Yeah, people are gonna be like, where'd you get those? Those are amazing.
The only problem, this posh shoe boutique, Palesi,
Welcome to Palesi.
doesn't exist. It's really a provocative social experiment by discount shoemaker Payless.
We built a fake luxury store, filled it with avant-garde sculptures and displays. We even hired a full team of sales associates. Then we filled all the shelves with Payless shoes.
This was a record-opening store for all of Payless history.
Turns out it was so convincing that these online fashion influencers were sold on the craftsmanship and looks of these hot shoes.
They're elegant, sophisticated.
I just think it's so classy.
And were shocked when they learned that shoes they would pay as much as $645 for, like these, were really just $35.
These are actually from Payless.
You've got to be kidding me.
Shut up. Are you serious?
The unsuspecting shoppers received full refunds, plus got the shoes for free. Payless tells us they simply wanted to change people's perceptions about what luxury should cost.
So as you can see here, the environment is enough for people to really have a different perception. And when does that perception actually become a reality? What are the neurophysiological roots of that behavior? Well, this is one of my favorite experiments that showcases what happens when we have that situation. So in this experiment, Plasman and her colleagues brought a group of wine connoisseurs. Those are people who really know their wine, apparently. Not necessarily true, but hey, they're supposed to know a lot about wine. And she brought them into the lab and gave them two different bottles of wine to taste. One of the bottles was priced at $90. The other one had a price of $10. Here's the catch. The two bottles were identical. Everything was exactly the same, except for the price tag on top. I'm picturing one in green and one in blue here in the slide, so you see what happened. But in reality, the labels were identical. Everything was the same except for the price tag on top. Now, when she asked the participants which wine tastes better, everybody reported that the $90 bottle of wine tasted better. And up to that point is an interesting study. However, she actually looked at the brain of participants when they were tasting the wine. And what they found was that the medial orbitofrontal cortex, that's the region in our brains behind our eyes, in the medial part of the brain, it activated more with the $90 bottle of wine compared to the $10 bottle of wine. Now, why is that region important? The region is important because that's the region in our brains that processes the pleasure or pleasantness that we perceive for taste and smells. Now imagine that. It's the same bottle of wine, but yet there's higher activation in the brain that gives people more pleasure with the more expensive bottle of wine. That's fascinating. And it showcases a couple of things that are very important for understanding food choices. The first one is that we humans are microbiologically wired to derive pleasure from consuming things that we think are prestigious. That's number one. This is the basis of marketing and how marketing works in terms of trying to portray branding and different positions of the brands. Now, the second one is important because it showcases the non-physical attributes of food affect how much we enjoy that food. So when we think about non-physical attributes, anything from whether the product is organic, where it was grown, whether it was sustainable, all of these other things affect how much we enjoy that particular product. Because once the activity in the brain happens that gives all the reward, that gives that pleasure, then the hormones that are released in our body actually give people more pleasure. So at that point, it is not perception anymore. It just became a reality where now these individuals indeed experience more pleasure when consuming the more expensive bottle of wine. Now, some of the latest work showcases that when we promote certain features in food that relate to taste, is really the pleasure areas of the brain that activate. While when we talk about certain things to promote health and nutritional aspects of food, the prefrontal cortex, or the area of the brain associated with self-control, tends to activate more. So it's almost like different messages in food are appealing to two different regions of the brain. One in which we're communicating, yes, this is good for you, it's tasty, go ahead and eat it. And the other region of the brain that is telling us, do not eat this, exercise self-control, this is not pleasurable. And so it's almost like we're appealing to two different aspects of food consumption. Now, how is this marketing working in terms of this interaction when we make decisions in social context? This is a very classic experiment conducted by Ash in the 1950s. And in this experiment, he asks participants to tell which of the three lines, A, B, or C, is closer in length to the target line I. And when he asked people individually, everybody got it right. There was less than 1% people who made errors. Now, in the treatment condition, there were some participants who were part of the experiment that would be answering this question before the actual participant. And so they will go on, the first person will say, oh, the answer is A. And the second person will go and say, hey, the answer is A. And the third person will go and say, it's A. And the fourth person will say, it's clearly A. Now, when the participant came and he didn't know that these other people were part of the experiment, the participant faced a decision. Do I go with what I think is the right answer, or do I conform to the group? And the answer was almost 37% of people conform to the group. So they provided a wrong answer because they did not want to go against the group. So this is the herd mentality that showcases that we humans want to belong and want to be part of this bigger social picture. The social validation is a big aspect of why we decide to do certain things, and we try to consume perhaps certain products to try to fit in to different types of groups. Another important concept that I want you to take from this lecture today is the concept of choice overload. Since we're kids, we're really trained to think that more choices, having more alternatives to choose from, is always better. But that's not necessarily the case. And Iyengar and Lepper warn us about this situation. Now, if you're like me, you go to try to choose a movie, even with the sophisticated algorithms that help you assess your taste and preferences for movies, sometimes it takes a while. It's like, there's nothing on Netflix. how is it possible that there's nothing on Netflix? Well, we face so many potential choices that it's difficult for us to really choose because we do not want to experience regret of not choosing the optimal product. And so this is illustrated in the original Iyengar and Lepper experiment, in which people came into a grocery store and there were two different conditions. In one of the conditions, people came into this tasting booth and there were only 6 flavors of jam. Now people went there, they tasted the jams, and they got a coupon to go to the jam section and buy as many products as they wanted at a discount. In the other condition, however, instead of 6 flavors of jam, there were 24 flavors of jam, including the 6 that were in the original experiment. So in this case, people had the same products that they had in the other condition, plus some extra products. What happened was fascinating, because while having more alternatives generated a lot more interest, as illustrated here by showing that a lot more people stopped by in the tasting booth to taste the products, at the end of the day, when it came down to sales, there were a lot less sales when there were too many products, showcasing this phenomenon known as choice overload. Having too many options make it less likely for people to actually pull the trigger and buy something. And we can see this in different domains. When you go into a store, a financial planner is trying to sell you something, insurance, decisions that are very complex, and we say, oh, let me think about this because there's so many options that I really want to think about it very carefully. And when do we think about it? Later. And we always postpone that decision because it's difficult for us to make that decision. Now, there are many contexts in which we flood people with information, and we always think more information is better. Well, that's not necessarily the case. This is an example of a pamphlet that we looked at, and the one on the left showcases the original design, and the information in the bottom left of the screen is the information that we were really trying to communicate to the public. And so these heat maps here show the visual attention, how much people actually look into those things. So the things that we wanted to convey were not receiving any attention. And so we try to simplify that because of this phenomenon and try to make it sometimes less is more, because it provides people with something more punctual to look into. So this is a good transition for us to think about domains in which we always think providing people with information is useful and they're going to use that information to make better decisions, right? After all, information is power. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And one of the research agendas that I have right now is understanding this phenomenon of information avoidance, when people purposely avoid knowing something to either protect their ego. So for example, I'm not going to try out for this team because I fear that I might not make it. I'm not going to apply to that position or to that university because, you know, I don't really want to go to that place because it's too hot or it's too cold anyway. So I try to protect my ego by avoiding certain type of information. Or perhaps I want to enjoy something and not experience any regret or guilt, or to avoid responsibility for an action. So some things, for example, we gave people the choice in a field experiment as to whether they wanted to see a menu that included calories or a menu that did not include calories. And about 27% of people chose the menu without calories, presumably because they wanted to enjoy their meal without feeling guilty about the amount of calories that they consumed. There's also another experiment we conducted recently with this information about forever chemicals. These are chemicals that are present in many products, in everyday products, and that unfortunately they get into our bloodstream and there's no way to take them out. This is why they're called forever chemicals. Sometimes they come in products, anything that relates to from Teflon cooking ware to popcorn, anything that prevents products from sticking from things typically contain PFAS. Well, 25% of people prefer not to know whether a product they were about to eat had these forever chemicals or not. And there's even other domains in which we are able to see that people avoid even receiving a payment to not find out the results of HIV test. So sometimes we human beings purposely avoid information, and that's an interesting area to do research and to understand what are some of these settings in which people do not want to find out useful information about their health, their nutrition, their well-being, and beyond. Part of the reason why we do that is because we want to keep a good image of ourselves. We do not want to hurt our ego or our self-image. And so it's almost like we might be at this situation at this time as pawns, but we want to feel and have these self-serving biases that really portray a very good picture representation of ourselves. And so that's one area in which I think there's going to be a lot of continued work to try to understand, are there ways in which when you use this type of interventions to try to motivate healthy behavior that promotes good nutrition, health, and well-being. So because of time constraints, I'm going to try to go into the self-control area, which is something that I think is fascinating. It's very important for us because it really defines how we react into temptation situations, and it really shapes our decisions in many domains, from what we eat, how we conserve and use our money, whether we have enough savings for retirement. There are many different aspects of our lives that require executive self-control. And this original experiment, it's known as the marshmallow experiment, in which kids were brought into the lab and they could either eat the marshmallow, but if they waited until the experimenters came back to the room, they would receive the reward of another marshmallow. And in the original experiment, they followed this cohort of kids until they were adults, and they were able to show that the number one determinant of success and well-being was whether they ate that marshmallow at age 4. Now, this is fascinating because a lot of the policies that we have today try to make something or correct something or address a problem in adult populations, but perhaps we should also be thinking about policies that enhance decision and well-being and self-control at age 4. Now, in this experiment, in this original experiment, it's important to understand, as I pointed out at the beginning, that not everybody faces the same urges. In fact, some of this work has shown that there is certain propensity for obese kids in which they have lower activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that's the self-control region in our brains, when they look at fast food restaurant signs compared to healthy weight kids. So this is important because these kids, in particular children, are exposed to a lot of advertising and they're exposed to these signs everywhere. And so it's important for us in terms of food policy to understand how these intricacies work. There are two main models when we started looking at these that try to explain self-control. One model says the more self-control I use, the better I behave, and if I am good, and the longer I engage in that behavior, the more likely I am to use that motivation to try to keep going on, and it's like a snowball that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So the more that I engage into self-control, the more likely I am to continue that self-control. Now, if you can relate to that situation, I know I do. The problem is that the other theory states complete opposite, and it says, no, self-control is like a resource. It's like a battery in your cell phone. That if you slept well, and if it's fully charged at the beginning of the day, if you start using self-control, then you start depleting those resources, and at the end of the day, if you've been too good, then you're less likely to exercise self-control because your battery is dead. It's so almost like, hey, I've been good all day long, now I deserve to have a big dinner. Now, if you can relate to that, I know I can. And so we started looking into these, and when we started looking at the brain activity individuals, we set up an initial task and a subsequent task where they're supposed to exercise self-control by refraining from purchasing something that was an impulse buying purchase. And so it's almost like you go to the store, you're buying milk, but you see that there's certain things that are 50% off, and you start getting those into your basket. That's the sort of impulse behavior we're trying to measure. And what we were able to see is that these two separate models were not two separate models, but they were actually the same model, in which originally if we exercise a little bit of self-control, we're more likely to continue exercising that self-control. But if we do too much, we eventually crumble and exercise less self-control. Now, this is important because it showcases that when we set goals, we want to try to make sure that we set goals that are realistic, but that are small enough for us to keep in that region that we're not overdoing them and setting ourselves to fail. And so setting goals is important because, hey, in New Year's, we set up goals where we're going to go from 0 to 200 miles an hour almost immediately. And we're trying to do too much, and that's not something that is sustainable. So we want to be able to generate these small victories in which we experience success, but we do not overdo it. So when we keep that level of motivation and we keep our fatigue and everything else on check. And so at the end of the day, it's important for us to truly think about this self-control activity and exercise, those small victories that will make it emotionally engaging, and it will make us more likely to exercise that self-control. We should keep those things in mind when we set up interventions. Many of those interventions relate to money, dollars and cents, and that's very important. The price, subsidies, taxes, all those things are big picture, typically public type of interventions, but not everything is about the money. People sometimes react and make decisions that relate to things that are not necessarily monetary related. We know that money and incentives, monetary incentives matter, but behavioral economics also incorporate these other aspects of decision making that are non-monetary. And so sometimes these decisions and these contexts in terms of behavior, benefiting other people, benefiting the actions of others, are things that are important for understanding human behavior. So with that, today we have talked about the importance of understanding the outcomes, but more importantly is to try to understand what makes people arrive to those outcomes. What are the behavioral motivations? What is the choice process like? Because in understanding that process is where we can really try to set up interventions that might be able to help the individual and achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve of having better nutrition, better diets, healthier, happier, and wealthier society. Thank you.